Good morning, everybody. Well, it's morning here. I don't know what time you're watching this, but as you guys know, the face-to-face classes for the next several weeks have been canceled and are being moved onto the online delivery format. And so because of this, I am having to sort of rework our schedule and the way that I'm delivering these classes to you. And I've done these voiceover video recordings of my PowerPoints before in the past. And so I think this is the best way for you guys to still get the information and not have to learn it necessarily by yourselves. You'll have me talking through each of these different topics. And so I just want to start by saying that I appreciate your flexibility and your ability to sort of withstand this situation, and I know that we will get through it together. This is a learning experience not only for me, but for all of you as well. But I still want to make sure that you guys are getting the best possible education, and this is just the best thing that I can think of doing for you guys so that you're still hearing and getting this information. So with that, I am going to start the section on joints. And I sort of started introducing you to joints in the lab whenever I'm asking questions like, what does this marking articulate with? When I'm talking about asking those questions, I'm referring to that joint. So I just want to start by saying we're going to work through this and let's get started talking about some joints. Okay. All right, so in this chapter, we are going to cover a few different objectives. So first and foremost, we're going to discuss some different functional and structural classifications for body joints themselves. We're going to discuss characteristics and features for fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. And we're going to talk about some different examples of each of those things. We're going to talk about and define and identify different body movements. And finally, discuss the structure of specific body joints and movements that are allowed by each of those different joints. Okay, so what is a joint? A joint is also called an articulation. So as I mentioned to you guys before, I've asked you this sort of working our way into the joint section in lab when I'm asking you, what does this marking articulate with? So a joint is also called an articulation. Basically, it's defined as any place where two bones that are sitting next to each other or a bone and a cartilage can come together and form this connection. And every single bone in the body has joints except the hyoid bone, because remember that the hyoid bone is the only bone in the body that does not actually articulate with any other bones. Okay, so every other bone in our entire body would articulate in a joint. And the way that we classify joints or sort of talk about them is either structural. So structural classification basically focuses on what is the material that's binding the two bones together. And then the functional classification is what can this joint do in terms of movement. And some joints can move a lot and some don't really move at all. So that's kind of getting us started into the functional classification. All right, so let's talk about these functional and structural classifications of body joints. All right, so we're going to start by discussing the structural classification of joints. And remember, this is referring to what is the material that's binding the two bones together. So we break this down into 3 different categories, the first category being fibrous joints. And fibrous joints are 2 bones that are connected by a fibrous connective tissue. Then cartilaginous joints are when bones are connected by either fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. And then finally, the third classification is synovial joints. And synovial joints are special because synovial joints, the 2 bones, or 3 bones, or whatever have you, the bones aren't actually touching each other. But they do come in contact with each other in this cavity, so in this sort of space that's filled with fluid. You have 2 bones meeting up, but they're sort of surrounded by this fluid and sort of encapsulated in this fluid. And usually the 2 places that are meeting up, they have some sort of articular cartilage that is covering those ends of the bones. And so because of this allows for free movement between bones, and these are the most common joints that are in the body. So we're going to talk a little bit more about synovial joints as we move on in this PowerPoint presentation. So we just discussed the sort of structural classifications of joints, but remember I also said that the joints are classified based on their functional characteristics, so based on what kind of movement can they actually do. And there's 3 major functional classifications. So the first major type of functional classification would be synarthrosis, and these are completely immovable joints. So these refer to things like the coronal suture, the lambdoid suture, the squamous suture. So all of the sutures of the skull are locations where 2 bones are actually meeting up, but they're not movable joints, so we call them a synarthrosis. The second type here are called amphiarthrosis or amphiarthroses, and the movement that occurs here is essentially just really small little movements. For example, in our intervertebral discs, so this is the place where 2 vertebrae are meeting together as we're going down the spinal column, vertebral column. We have this little intervertebral disc, and this is excuse me, made of fibrocartilage. And because of the sort of structural integrity of fibrocartilage, it doesn't really bend and twist and rotate and do all that very easily, and so we have very little movement that's occurring here. Okay, and so anything with just a really small amount of movement is falling into the category of being an amphiarthrosis. And then finally, diarthroses. These are freely movable joints, things like the hip and the shoulder. These joints, because of kind of referring back to the structural aspect of it, because of the way that the bones are actually meeting up together, it allows a lot more movement. So if you're looking at this in the ball of the head of the femur here is going to fit nicely into this acetabulum in the hip bone. And because of the shape of these 2 things, that then would kind of play into the functional ability of the hip bone, and the femur specifically, to be able to move really freely within this joint space. Okay.